Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. My name is Ralf Süttorf. I'm the director of the Center for Humanitarian Action, CHA. I welcome you to the next out-of-the-box lunch meeting format we are very often hosting. And today, hosting together with IRC Germany, we are very grateful for on a very urgent and hot topic. But before jumping into this, hinting as always on the regular housekeeping slide where you might just run through quickly when we share it in a second, and maybe hinting on one still fairly new feature. In case you are not a native English speaker, you can use the live captions for English transcripts, or select your preferred language for simultaneous translations. We hope that's of help. Whenever we talk these days about Gaza crisis or Sudan, about latest news from Ukraine or Yemen, this topic always lies at the heart of most debates. It's humanitarian diplomacy. It's surely one of the most relevant and concrete humanitarian issues and challenges these days. That's due to extremely frequent disrespect in all these top crises and many more crises of humanitarian law, of humanitarian access, of principles, and some crises, even regular war crimes have been identified, or there's talk of even genocide, and many calling it this way in Gaza. This is why international calls for much greater diplomatic engagement of governments has gathered great momentum last years. And various governments, including Germany, have made humanitarian diplomacy a strategic top priority. On the other hand, while humanitarian diplomacy covers a very concrete challenge, it's very hard and vague to define and to nail its concept down, to fix when it is successful and why, how to measure this, and to systemize how to approach it in which way. This is why we are the more grateful that we have today's speakers who will explain it all to us and even share one paper on this very topic, as we will welcome Amsel Saleem, Senior Conflict and Humanitarian Policy Analyst of IRC, and dialing in from New York. Welcome, Amsel. Amsel will be followed when we discuss by Max Freundlieb what the lessons learned from the paper might mean for the humanitarian diplomacy of Germany and German agencies, as Max is political advisor of Diakonie Katastrophenhilfe. Welcome, Max. And the discussion will be concluded by a quick reaction of the German Federal Foreign Office, which, when we discuss these matters which are related to their policies, we always invite to react to the panel in a quick contribution. And Christina Förster has been so kind to volunteer for that. She's the deputy head of the Humanitarian Program section of GFFO. Welcome, Christina. As always, please feel free also to engage yourselves by comments and questions in the chat, which we will then try to share with the panel in the last part of our short discussion this afternoon. But let's start with Amsel and her presenting the findings of the IRC paper called Access Entangled, Negotiating Access Through High-Level Diplomacy. Amsel is a senior policy analyst of IRC. As mentioned, she's based in New York. She's been for almost 4 years with IRC, with a regional focus on East Africa and the Middle East. And she's especially an expert on the intersection between geopolitical analysis, global policy, and humanitarian action. So that sounds like a perfect profile for the topic of the day. And with that, over to you, Amsel.
Thanks so much, Ralph. I'm quickly going to share my screen. Please let me know if you're able to view this.
This looks good. Well, yeah, now it's perfect and complete.
Great. All right, I'm happy to begin if we're good. All right. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today for what I believe is really such a timely and important discussion, and it's really close to my heart. My name is Amsel, and I'll be covering select portions of our new report called Access Entangled, which is our attempt to really make sense of how high-level diplomacy can affect humanitarian access. And just a quick caveat, due to time constraints, I won't be able to go over all of the findings of the report, but that gives you all the more opportunity to actually dive into the report, reflect over the findings, and I'm always available for a follow-up discussion via email. All right, so let's just jump in very quickly. I'm going to give a quick overview of the methodology. So the way we approached this analysis was we investigated 5 different crises that you can see on the screen. You'll see 2 of them are developing crises. And because the report was published in March 2025, it doesn't actually cover a lot of the latest developments within those 2 developing crises, namely Gaza and Sudan. Nevertheless, we do believe that the findings of the report are still pretty evergreen, and the framework that we develop here can be applied to developing crises of today as well. The way we approached this research was twofold. So we conducted desk-based analysis, as well as conducted key informant interviews with about 15 humanitarian experts. And this was from all over the humanitarian ether, people from the UN, NGOs, think tanks, etc. A lot of them were working as aid actors on the ground as well. And we grounded this research in OCHA's definition of humanitarian diplomacy, which you can also see on the screen. So a quick clarification, the research is not attempting to make a value judgment on whether high-level efforts are the right or wrong way to improve access. We recognize there's many tools, both at the local and high level to attempt to engage on the topic of humanitarian access. The question here really is, what are the distinct characteristics of high-level diplomacy to improve access? And how can knowing the risks and benefits of each characteristic really help us understand better on how to make high-level diplomacy more effective? So as I said, it's about characteristics and what the risks and benefits are. So I'm going to jump in really quickly into 3 different characteristics that we identified. The first one is high political profile. So here, in the simplest of terms, high-level diplomacy often involves senior diplomats from global powers and global institutions. Our research from, the 5 different comparative conflicts that we studied, the seniority can really help raise the profile of aid obstruction and create public and normative pressure on conflict parties to reaffirm their obligations under IHL, including access. Why does this matter? It is especially important when local voices are silenced or entire conflicts are ignored. The Sudan example here fits perfectly. So when the Sudan war broke out, the Jeddah commitments in 2023 were a big way in making sure that conflict parties publicly committed to their obligations under IHL at a time when attacks on civilians were rampant, attacks on aid actors were rampant, and access denial was increasingly being seen as a strategy of war. It also led to the creation of the Joint Humanitarian Forum, or JHF, and that was really the first attempt by high-level actors to push for access in Sudan. It was a forum that was established to coordinate aid between conflict parties, the UN, NGOs at a time when access was really difficult on the ground. And it was significant because Sudan was increasingly feared to become an ignored conflict. These high-level engagements really brought it to the forefront. But I can use the Sudan example to elaborate the risk here as well. The seniority of participants can centralize decision-making and risk sidelining local actors. Why? Because people sometimes tend to over-index to the ability of high-level diplomacy to achieve success in access and let go of the other sort of local level efforts. So in Sudan, as I mentioned, the JHF was very promising when it was first established, but it faced significant issues. It faced funding problems, high staff turnover, there were month-long delays in decision-making like visas. But despite this, because the JHF was formed under this large umbrella of the Jeddah commitments, various actors, local actors, conflict parties, even UN OCHA at times deferred to the forum, and multiple key informant interviews confirmed this for us. And that slowed progress, which weakened the ability of aid actors to go and independently negotiate access. Our second point is broad stakeholder presence. So again, very simply, as conflicts are becoming more internationalized, the number of diplomatic stakeholders is also increasing. So the number of diplomatic stakeholders that are interested in conflict and engaged in these diplomatic engagements are also increasing. That includes the UN, global powers like the United States, the UK, even newly prominent powers like Turkey, Egypt, or the UAE, and also regional actors like the African Union, IGAD, etc. And the more stakeholders are involved in these discussions, the different types and levels of leverage are available to exercise over warring parties to get them to improve access or commit to other IHL priorities. And this is really where high-level diplomacy shines and is different from local engagement. Because when these third-party states and the UN are able to coordinate their leverage, they can apply unified pressure. And I can use the Ethiopia example here to illustrate that point, or an attempt to illustrate this point. So in the Ethiopia and Tigray War, I think everyone in this audience knows access constraints were extremely severe. Aid almost couldn't even enter Tigray at many points, and there was a really concerted attempt to improve access on the international scale. And as a way to push the Ethiopian government to improve access, a few countries attempted to leverage their development aid. So the European Union suspended about 90 million euros in development aid. The US suspended non-humanitarian assistance. And both of them, in their public statements, said this was an attempt to improve access or get the Ethiopian government to move the needle on access in Tigray. And these attempts show how aligned diplomacy can really elevate access as a priority. But I can use the Ethiopia example to illustrate the risk here. So the more actors are involved, the more political interests can undermine the collective leverage they are attempting to use. So even though the European Union suspended this amount of aid to pressure the government for improving access, Germany did not. And the United States, even though they suspended non-humanitarian assistance, it continued to maintain its rhetorical ties, continued to mention Ethiopia as a major partner. And all of these things ultimately undermined the collective pressure they were attempting to place on Ethiopia. Ultimately, what happened was access really only improved when the peace agreement was signed. All right. Our third point here is the diversity of objectives, which is a little bit related to our second point, but I'm going to separate it out here to illustrate specific important points in high-level diplomacy. And that is access is rarely the sole focus of discussions in high-level diplomacy. What that means is access rarely brings senior-level diplomats to the table. It's often the need to, achieve a ceasefire, maybe a de-escalation. At times it's to achieve a peace settlement or even, discuss post-conflict governance. And then access gets folded in as one of those, as one of the priorities. There is a benefit to this. So when you bundle the topic of access to the same level as these other priorities, it can really help elevate the significance of access. And that's important because access is not always well understood as a topic, even though it's key to enabling aid delivery and ensuring that the civilians at risk in these conflicts are protected. But the risk here is that the more access is bundled with all of these political goals, the greater the risk that A, it becomes secondary, or B, it becomes politicized. And this is a little bit complicated, so I'm going to use the Yemen example to illustrate the point. So in Yemen, there was an agreement signed called the Stockholm Agreement in 2018. The Stockholm Agreement was essentially an agreement to achieve a localized ceasefire to prevent conflict over the Hodeidah port, which is a critical entry point for food and supplies, etc. And because it was to avoid conflict in an entry port, as part of the agreement, they had also included some clauses on addressing import restrictions imposed by the Saudi-led coalition, which obviously would have significant impacts on the ability of aid actors to bring aid into Yemen. But because this agreement that included some clauses on access was primarily a ceasefire agreement, the UN prioritized ceasefire monitoring over improving aid delivery. The result here was, even though the ceasefire was primarily successful, humanitarian access only marginally improved. Ships still waited about 36 days for clearance. The lesson here is that the focus on avoiding violence, which was absolutely necessary, it did mean that little pressure was placed on parties to streamline their aid movement. The second risk here is the more access is bundled with other political goals, the greater the risk of politicization. And in the worst cases, access may be made conditional on the success of other political objectives as well. And we invite you to read the report for more details on that as well. I know that I'm probably running out of time very quickly, so I'm just going to skip over to two key recommendations that I wanted to highlight. We have a set of recommendations in the report itself that I invite you to read, but I want to spotlight these two. The first one is to ensure that efforts to conduct high-level diplomacy on access is given adequate financial and staffing support. The reason why this is important is what was illustrated in the high political profile problem. Without consistent and dedicated engagement, what can happen with access diplomacy is they can really fall through the cracks, while at the same time creating this expectation of success and undermining the space for local engagement, for example. The second is to really firewall humanitarian objectives from the political objectives that bring high-level diplomats together. And this is really about making sure there's a concerted effort to ensure access is negotiated outside the political objectives, which includes peace settlements, which includes decisions on post-conflict governance. And at times, this even means setting up entirely different interlocutors where possible in different rooms, leading different conversations. And really what it means is prioritizing access to the fullest extent and making sure discussions are grounded in humanitarian principles, so they are not politicized or made conditional on political objectives. All right, I think that is it.
Thank you so much, Amsel. Really to the point, extremely comprehensive, and really a strong recommendation to read the report. It's a quick read, which is a compliment, because it's really comprehensive and to the point also in the longer outline. Maybe one follow-up question from my side before we move to Max, on the very interesting 3 characteristics you looked into, and also in the context of that you've been had taken such a comprehensive approach, really also looking into the tensions and the trade-offs between different approaches and policies. While we often discuss this in a way like appealing to donors, where you just have to engage more, you just have to do more, be coherent, and that's the fix. May I ask, also on your recommendations beyond what you could share in the quick presentation, because the 3 characteristics of, for example, you need high-level political engagement from various sides, but you have a lot of challenges to face if too many political interests come in. That's interlinked, and hardly any given donor can probably disconnect. So was it still possible for you to come up with some recommendation how to manage this natural tension, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, diversity of objectives and broad stakeholder presence, both are very highly interlinked. And the more stakeholders there are, the more objectives there are playing. So obviously, there is that tension here. It is about essentially ensuring that, I mean, I believe states itself need to ensure that there is adequate capacity, staffing capacity, and also research capacity for both. Often what happens is one gets prioritized over the other. The second is, I have this in my recommendations in the report itself, it's about consultation with the broader ethos. So ensuring that there's specific setups of consultation with NGOs, with the UN, local actors, to really see how humanitarian diplomacy can be used to ensure that there's a benefit to them. So really, I mean, there will always be a tension, but it's to make sure at the state level that this tension is tackled with resourcing capacity and staffing capacity, and ensuring that decisions made on humanitarian diplomacy are informed by the local level.
Many thanks. So that would target the resources question, which I'm sure we will touch on later on once again. While it's probably a much bigger challenge to deal with the political challenges of maybe trade-offs between very different political objectives, right? Like if you prioritize a ceasefire over access, it might be hard to convince all players involved to deprioritize and focus on access only as has been highlighted. Maybe just a quick point, you talked also about coherence of donors more on the practical, maybe less political side, or maybe also in an institutional way. Could you elaborate a bit on like the example of Ethiopia, or you dealt a lot with Sudan, I know, how also on a lower level with very detailed decisions, who's blocking at which point in time development assistance while releasing humanitarian one, who's blocking aid but supporting politically still the ones who are tried to be sanctioned, etc. Is this, you shared the example of Ethiopia, is this exemplary for the other case studies you looked into, or how would you judge on this overall?
So we haven't found such a specific, and which is why I thought this example was so important to reflect on, because we actually haven't seen a lot of cases of using specific points of leverage to improve access. But that is the point of the report, is this is where high-level diplomacy really shines, is when different stakeholders are involved, they are able to use the leverage they have over conflict parties. And we feel that currently the way in which it's been exercised, that characteristic has not been used to its fullest extent. There was an attempt to use it in Ethiopia, but I mean, it would be great to actually, sit down, investigate how different types of leverages can really be used for other conflicts as well, and prioritize access in that way.
Okay, many thanks, Amsel. For now, we come back to you in a second. Now moving on to Max and looking into the second part of this event on the role of governments like Germany and German actors overall, and suggestions how donors could live up to maybe the guidance, the recommendations, the expectations also shared in Amsel's paper. Max, you kindly join us from holiday, so I'm sure you are at a spot almost as cool as New York, somewhere Baltic Sea, Heringsdorf or something fancy, I understand. When not on holiday, Max is advising German NGO Diakonie Katastrophenhilfe on humanitarian advocacy and leads its lobbying efforts with parliament and governments. He previously worked with ICRC and by that also was involved, for example, in the crisis team dealing in the Russia-Ukraine conflict in the confidential humanitarian negotiations with the conflict parties. So he knows it from the political and the operational side. Max, on behalf of this experience and your current work in Berlin, how does what you heard about the recommendations, about the analysis of IRC is resonating with your experience?
Thanks a lot, Ralf, and thanks a lot, Amsel, for the input. I think we're at a time where power is used to block humanitarian action. And we see this with the record number of workers being killed, the access restrictions, the bureaucratic impediments. And so I think it makes perfect sense to use state power to kind of open up the space for humanitarian action through humanitarian diplomacy. But I think it's important to be careful when states adopt the term humanitarian, because we've seen it go wrong with the humanitarian intervention phase. And so I appreciate that Amsel and IC have put out this report, which kind of shines the light on when does humanitarian diplomacy work and when it doesn't work, and where do we need to be careful and where do we not need to be careful. Two things I particularly appreciated. One is that I think IHL compliance should be the beginning of a negotiation process and should not be diluted into the outcome of a political process. Number two is I think the risk of centralizing access negotiations in the hands of non-humanitarian political stakeholders, be that the Security Council or be that other fora. One, I think, as Amsel rightly pointed out, it takes away the agency of head of missions or humanitarian staff on the ground, right, which knows the situation better than anybody else and who should be in charge of enabling humanitarian access. And the second thing is, I think if you move humanitarian objectives into a political space, political actors are going to do what political actors do. They're going to use those humanitarian objectives to advance their own goal, right? So you're kind of paving the way for the politicization of humanitarian action. I would add one additional risk. the core business of states and of diplomacy is to prevent and resolve conflict. And I think they're not really doing a good job right now. And I think both states and the Security Council are failing to live up to that mission. And sometimes I'm slightly cautious that the new focus and the agreement with the term humanitarian diplomacy is also used to shield away from their failure to really resolve and prevent armed conflict. And I think with that, we need to be really careful.
Many thanks, Max. Your video has been broken now and then, but your audio has been perfect. So at least if anybody else would let me know differently, I think we could hear it all loud and clear. And many thanks for the very comprehensive feedback already. If one compares the recommendations and expectations outlined with the German setting, maybe just for the background of colleagues not dealing every day with humanitarian assistance, as mentioned, Germany has made humanitarian diplomacy a top priority in its latest humanitarian strategy, and we can take a quick look, maybe in a very simple graphic out of this strategy on these priorities. Which have been highlighted there. In total, 3 main areas and 12 objectives within these areas. Humanitarian diplomacy has been defined. Here you see it up front on the left as one of the key tools to deal with limited IHL and humanitarian access, etc. Max, maybe as follow-up question to you, if you look at what you've cited when it was released about 1 year ago in the strategy and how it's by now implemented, and Germany engaging in key crises like Sudan, like Gaza, for example, what's your judgment? To which extent would you say the German government is living up to these expectations raised?
Yeah, that's definitely an easy question. I appreciated the strategy when it came out because I think it kind of paved the way for Germany to take a bigger role in the humanitarian sector and kind of use the influence it has also as the potentially now biggest or second biggest donor to influence humanitarian policy and also open up the space for humanitarian action. So I think that was something I particularly appreciated. And I think in the strategy, there's a number of useful things. There's a call for action with France that was reaffirmed. I'm not sure where it's standing right now. There's the commitment to ensuring that sanctions are not limiting humanitarian space. There's the commitment to engage with civil society, in-country, local actors to kind of use their input to inform humanitarian diplomacy processes. So all that commitment I really appreciated. It's a paper, it's a policy, and to be honest, it was last government's policy, and I know that technical policies don't always change, but the political context in which it's being implemented obviously does change, and now we're having a conservative-led government where I'm not sure how much buy-in we have on the highest level of the foreign ministry into humanitarian diplomacy. I was reading Wadefuhl's, so our foreign minister, Dr. Johan Wadefuhl's speech at the ambassadors conference 2 weeks ago, I think it was, BOKO. And he was focusing on security, military security, prosperity, and liberty. And I think it was very much focused on EU, NATO, economic opportunities abroad, and the entire threat posed by Russia in German perception. The term humanitarian was mentioned one time in the context of the crisis in Sudan. And it's a speech, and I don't want to overrate it, but this might give a hint if we don't have the buy-in from the top of the house for humanitarian diplomacy, that humanitarian diplomacy by Germany might be much weaker in the years to come. I think the resource question that Amsel mentioned is extremely important because we've seen the last 4 years we had 2 humanitarian envoys, one for Gaza and one for Sudan. Both positions were added to the regular portfolio of a state secretary and humanitarian director. I'm neither a state secretary nor a humanitarian director, but these people always look really busy. And so I think taking on the job of negotiating humanitarian access in extremely complicated political settings like Gaza or Sudan is not an easy task. So I'm not sure how meaningful they can do their job if they have the entire normal portfolio on top of the humanitarian diplomacy portfolio. And then on the technical level, we're in quite regular contact with the GFFO humanitarian staff. They're doing the regular work, and on top, they're doing humanitarian diplomacy work. And so I think if humanitarian diplomacy is here to stay as a priority for Germany, which I hope it will, then additional resources need to be added. I think I also want to appreciate the openness to NGO input. We've had a number of confidential engagements on a number of contexts, where the GFFO has always been really open to kind of hear our feedback on what is and isn't working in the context. And there's also a reference group on humanitarian diplomacy for the strategy implementation that I'm a member of. That's the good stuff. I think we need to talk about Gaza when we're talking about humanitarian diplomacy, because there was the high-profile case for the Germans to kind of pilot humanitarian diplomacy. And I think if we use Gaza as an example to judge Germany's track record on humanitarian diplomacy, I don't think I'm going to have a very good opinion on that. I think there was a lot of efforts, and with Baerbock also on the highest level, to really pass the messaging and to really pressure with words for humanitarian access and better protection. But I think if you're enabling a conflict party through political and military support, and that support essentially stays the same until very recently, but even now, Germany is still blocking political process on the EU level. And so essentially, you're enabling a conflict party to pursue a conflict and the limitation of the humanitarian space that we've been seeing for over nearly 2 years now. And then at the same time, you're claiming to do humanitarian diplomacy without being willing to use the leverage you have over the conflict party to actually improve the humanitarian the compliance with IHL. Then sometimes I'm concerned that humanitarian diplomacy is more a fig leaf as opposed to real effort to open up the humanitarian space, because then you could do other means and measures. And I also think, let's be honest, the humanitarian team in the GFFO is not the one determining Germany's policy on Gaza. And the German government is not one coherent voice. There's a number of actors in the government with different and competing interests. But I think at some point of time, we need to be honest that if humanitarian access doesn't have the priority within the overall policy towards Gaza, then maybe we should be careful of labeling that humanitarian diplomacy. Because I think if we look at the net evaluation of what Germany has done for access and protection in Gaza, I'm not sure that for the people in Gaza, that's a net positive thing. I would rather say it's a net negative thing. Maybe one more, I don't want to call it a recommendation because Christina knows humanitarian diplomacy much better than I do. But I think if we're moving into a much more localized humanitarian system, the GFFO needs to get better off in getting the input from local actors to inform humanitarian diplomacy efforts. I think much is happening by predominantly white international NGOs who have the advocacy resources to kind of also feed into the humanitarian diplomacy efforts of the GFFO. And I think that's important that that availability is there. But somehow there needs to be additional challenges and resources on the ground in missions and embassy to kind of be better at networking with civil society partners. This is number one. And number two is more an open question. I think if we're moving into a more localized humanitarian system, and I really hope we are, I think a lot of those actors on the local level are facing obstacles to their work that are not traditionally associated with the humanitarian space. They are much more associated with civic space, right? We can be talking about like limitations on the freedom of assembly, about union busting, about NGO laws. And so I'd be curious to see how far the GFFO would go in the humanitarian engagement to kind of protect local actors in their work, but also obviously needing to respect the sovereignty of the state. And I think it's a complicated measure, but I think it's a question that will kind of accompany us for the upcoming years, because the role of local actors is going to grow and access restrictions are going to grow. And I hope Germany stays engaged on the humanitarian diplomacy. And so somehow we need to find an answer on that.
Many thanks, Max. Maybe quickly asking Amsel on one point you underlined and then moving to Christina. This point of local engagement and potential tensions between what's going on the community level, and which might be pretty promising and driven by the ones affected, etc., etc. While many actors like us, like the humanitarian community in northern countries, is for other good reasons calling for more efforts on the high-level diplomacy. You have highlighted how important this is, etc. And you mentioned in the paper a couple, and briefly one before, tensions, how this can come into conflict by local actors, by local conflict parties, for example, hinting on, well, we don't want to deal with these humanitarian issues now because there are macro level talks going on, and they might be blocked for years, but using that as an excuse. Is this a point you have cited in a couple of case studies, and something really deeper to look into by all of us, at least in the global north? Sorry, you're still muted, Amsel.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Yes, absolutely. I mean, that is what the high political profile characteristic tries to identify, is that tension between making sure that access is elevated and highlighted as a key problem for these conflicts. But then when it is elevated, then there's a tendency to over-index to the ability of high-level diplomacy to achieve success. I think it's really about understanding where high-level diplomacy stands and what success it can achieve. So an example that comes up in my mind is the Adre border crossing in Sudan. So that was a major success that high-level diplomacy was able to achieve. A lot of the ALPS processes, their focus on access, their focus on ensuring renewals for the Adre, and for those who don't know, it is a cross-border aid delivery mechanism that allows aid to be delivered into Sudan, into inaccessible places into Sudan through Chad. And that was achieved through consistent high-level diplomacy with conflict parties within Sudan. And that's where high-level diplomacy really shines. But when you have high-level diplomacy enter into really local level nitty-gritties, that's when it gets a little bit complicated, and a lot of local level actors, that's when the tension really comes up. So I would say it's really about making sure that high-level diplomacy prioritizes what it does best, and it's able to make sure that what it's doing is complementary to local engagement. It never interrupts or what's the word? It doesn't replace local level engagement, because that's where it really is important to make sure that the agency of local engagement is at the very, very forefront.
Many thanks, Amsel, for clarifying or more elaborating also this point. Just for the colleagues, I've seen some interactive applause now and then already. If you would like to come on with questions and comments, please put them now into the chat. Then we will have a chance to share it before we close at 3 p.m. But for now, Christina, many big questions and many big asks as always. With a donor government, maybe asking in the first place this call for firewalling, for coherence, etc. Does it sometimes sound to you like a naive discussion as humanitarians keep talking about?
Yes, thank you very much. And I was listening very carefully, and there's a lot I think we could potentially discuss, but this was exactly one of the points I wanted to raise. The firewalling of certain objectives. I think we went into a different direction. I was glad that the strategy has already been mentioned. Thank you, Max, for that. And also thank you for being delighted to see this, because our vision has now become much clearer than it was when we have published the strategy. And I think what to us is entirely clear, that the key objective of humanitarian diplomacy is to alleviate the suffering from people. And we don't really try to firewall this objective, but rather explain how it fits into so-called classic or traditional diplomacy that puts a state's interest in the center. We think that ultimately, and in most cases, in all cases basically, it is in our state's interest to alleviate the suffering from people for various reasons, which I don't even want to elaborate on. But whatever we do is also deeply rooted in international humanitarian law. And I want to really make the point that access for us is not an overlooked issue, but rather at the center of our humanitarian diplomacy, because the key objectives we pursue is to improve access and reinforce protection of civilians and humanitarian operations. And we see this as a backbone not only of our programming work and of our collaboration with partners through projects, but also as a backbone of crisis diplomacy. And the short answer to firewalling access issues from other political questions is a quote I always like to quote the president of the ICRC, Ms. Spoljaric-Egger, who once said there are 100 steps of peace, but the first one always needs to be humanitarian. So we're not talking about firewalling, but rather sequencing. And I fully agree that we need to pay a lot of attention to how we frame humanitarian diplomacy and not to interlink it with crisis diplomacy or the resolution of conflicts, but rather insist that in every crisis there need to be certain steps, and the first ones most obviously need to be humanitarian. So I think that there are a lot of arguments to not put things into isolation, but rather see the bigger picture, where it really helps to raise attention and to reinforce issues when we think in a sequence rather than in boxes.
Many thanks, Christina. Maybe quickly following up on 2 points. One, you mentioned that since the strategy has been published, a vision for the German humanitarian diplomacy has been developed. We would be, of course, very keen to learn more about that. And second point, maybe more on the practical side. What would it mean in practical terms? Because I think in many contexts, it makes extremely lot of sense to talk about sequencing, etc. In some of the cases shared by the colleagues, of course, but we talk about really conflicting political interests and conflicting political objectives. And is it then naive, or is it also maybe a given if Germany makes humanitarian diplomacy a priority, to ask, well, then you have to resource it. Then it can't be one of 12 topics in your humanitarian strategy. Then you need budget and stuff, and none of this is given compared to years ago. So how to deal with these practical challenges, and what's the vision nevertheless?
So maybe also a methodological remark, if I may, on the study. I found it very interesting that of all the people that have been asked and interviewed, there were no diplomats. Maybe there is a specific angle also missing, because with hindsight, I think everyone is always wiser. And obviously, diplomacy, neither humanitarian nor classical diplomacy, is without fault, but always with a purpose and with the very best intentions. And here, I think we just need to also with the example of Gaza in the back of my head, maybe. We can't always measure success that easy in diplomacy. So, and as the study also rightly points out, a lot of diplomacy happens behind closed doors. And this was certainly the case for Gaza. And maybe the outcome was not what we would have wished for, but I can assure you that there has been relentless humanitarian diplomacy by our envoys, by the foreign minister himself, who at times had daily conversations with the Israeli government, who at times could name every single case of NGOs who don't have a registration by now. So there's a really top level acknowledgement of the importance of such issues. And the pivot of all our interventions and the pivot of everything we do in humanitarian diplomacy is dialogue with our partners. So this is really at heart of everything we do, and mainstreamed into all of our foreign policy and humanitarian diplomacy work. Maybe to elaborate a bit on the instruments and the visions we have, I think a clear field that we have identified is coordination and using our leverage and our influence on key actors. And this has been mentioned already. So this is something we use in all crises, and not only on the top level, I want to say, but also on a much lower level. Sometimes it can be as effective to send your ambassador to a district governor to say there are cash restrictions we disagree with, and which lead to inefficiencies and people not being need with assistance in a timely manner. This can be as effective as a call by the minister to his counterpart. So we try to use the whole range of our network to reinforce humanitarian objectives. The second thing is agenda setting and our policy work, which we do. For example, there are many, but I think the most striking one is Germany co-hosting the Sudan conference, both in Paris and London last year. Which was not only a role as a co-host, but also involved a lot of work in the background. So we made sure that our key asks were distributed through our network. So we had aligned messages with like-minded partners and beyond. So we also made the case for additional pledges, financial commitments, etc. So agenda setting is a very important issue and remains at heart of what we do. High-level diplomacy is certainly also an element that we have explored further, and where we really depend on timely input from our partners. And we also greatly value local input, but often we don't have the right channels, and hope that our NGO partners and others will make sure that we also reflect local voices in our policy action. The fourth point I wanted to mention is our programming and financing humanitarian projects that are tailored to our portfolio and also mainstream some of the humanitarian diplomacy points we have. There's also a fifth point, a need to strengthen capacities within our own system. We need to raise awareness in our network for humanitarian diplomacy, what it means and what the division of labor is. And the last thing, which also we put an emphasis on, defending red lines and responding to deteriorating situations, where we also make use ultimately of instruments such as sanctions, etc. So these are the fields where we want to operationalize our humanitarian diplomacy, and maybe I'll leave it here.
Many thanks, Christina. I just wanted to say, Max, I'm sure you would be keen to come in maybe, for example, on Gaza, but please, Amsel, also feel free to feedback on what you've heard on the baseline of your paper. Max, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Christina. And I think for me, the Gaza case is the perfect example where humanitarian diplomacy works and doesn't work, because we're not talking about there's a lack of information or an access regulation is stuck in the bureaucracy. We're talking about the systematic blocking of humanitarian aid, right? It's been used in warfare. And I think at that time, we've seen it for like 2 years now, dialogue is not enough. Like, I recognize the importance of confidential dialogue. I've seen it, and I know that Germany has a specific influence on Israel. But it's not enough. It's not working out. And so I think if you see that dialogue is not enough to enhance the protection of civilians, and you have leverage over a conflict party, then for me, humanitarian diplomacy, especially if you frame it as open as saying it includes alleviating suffering, should include using economic or political resource you have to force a conflict party into compliance with international humanitarian law. IHL is non-negotiable. That should be the baseline. And so I think if we stick with humanitarian diplomacy only to dialogue, and then the other side essentially says, yes, we listen to you, but no, thank you, we're not going to implement that, then what purpose does humanitarian diplomacy really have? What added value does it bring for people in crisis situations? And I think asking, like, I think if we evaluate humanitarian diplomacy, we should evaluate it not from an NGO like mine based in Germany. We should evaluate it from the position of civilians caught in armed conflict. And I think that should be the measurement to evaluate Germany's humanitarian diplomacy for Gaza, to look at people in Gaza and ask, has your protection, has your access to aid improved through diplomacy? And I'd love to say yes, but I'm skeptical that the answer is a resounding yes. On the second point of humanitarian diplomacy, I do really think it's cool that the GFFO has kind of developed that vision, and I think we're looking forward to engaging on this as an NGO network. I think if the definition of humanitarian diplomacy is all the measures alleviating humanitarian suffering, this includes a lot of efforts. And I was looking through a parliamentary inquiry from a couple of months ago it came from Conservative when the old government was still in place. And you have so many humanitarian diplomacy efforts in Gaza, in Syria, in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Sudan, in Horn of Africa, in Sahel, DRC, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Bangladesh, Ukraine, and Nagorno-Karabakh. And a lot of the efforts that are being listed mean coordinating with the United Nations, early warning system with NGOs, coordinating with local actors, coordination among donors. You mentioned the example of Sudan, the funding conference. If all of this includes humanitarian diplomacy, that's essentially Germany's entire humanitarian engagement counting as humanitarian diplomacy. And I think with that, we need to be a bit careful because humanitarian diplomacy, as I understood it, is really meant to influence conflict parties or those with power over other conflict parties to enable humanitarian access and improve the protection of civilians. And I get that like a lot of these efforts have secondary effects, but I think I'd be curious to see where does humanitarian engagement with Germany start and where does it merge into humanitarian diplomacy, or is it the exact same thing?
Many thanks, Max. So let's give Amsel a chance to come in for a reaction to Christina or Max as well. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Ralph. So obviously, I don't know the German context as well as Christina and Max do, but I did want to respond to one of the points that Christina raised about sequencing humanitarian objectives and political objectives. I completely agree. That's absolutely where we want humanitarian diplomacy to go. But I think that is also where a lot of high-level diplomats get the mix wrong sometimes. And I'll use a very specific example here: humanitarian ceasefires. Ceasefires themselves are very political in of themselves. When you add humanitarian ceasefires to them, you are aiming for a very time-bound improvement to humanitarian access, for example. And we've seen this in a lot of conflicts in Gaza as well. There's a call for achieving a humanitarian ceasefire. What that does is it creates this incentive to achieve a very time-bound success on access that doesn't really improve the quality of access, but it does improve the quantity of trucks, for example, that enter a place, and that is then used as a win for humanitarian diplomacy. But really, it is motivated by this political motivation to achieve a specific win on access. That's what we want to avoid when I say firewalling, or if you want to mention sequencing, completely agree with that. But it is really about making sure that access and the negotiations for access at the high diplomatic level are not based on achieving these very specific and time-bound wins on access, but are really about improving the overall quality of access so that, for example, in Gaza, the most amount of trucks that enter are when there's these temporary ceasefires. And the most amount of access is when there's temporary ceasefires. That's what we don't want. We want an improvement in overall humanitarian access that is based on principled humanitarian action and that is not motivated or as a result of political negotiations on ceasefires, for example. So that's kind of where I would tease out the sequencing and firewalling.
Many thanks, Amsel and Christina. Maybe adding a quick question also from the chat, Gaston from DRC. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. How can humanitarian diplomacy more effectively influence decision makers at the governmental level, especially in politically sensitive contexts? Also asking how can there be broader leverage beyond the humanitarian bubble, as I understand it. Christina, over to you for a quick reply, if you might.
So maybe I think on Gaza, the bottom line is that we can all agree to the key objective: long-lasting peace in the Middle East, unconditional, rapid humanitarian access, etc. But the reality of diplomacy is that you don't always achieve your maximum goal, and the second best option is to go for what is realistic and achievable in the conditions you face. And this is why we ended up in a temporary humanitarian pause to allow for the polio vaccination campaign, etc., etc. So and also on Israel, we have called out Israel at a very early stage, and the minister and even the chancellor has been very clear on what we expect from Israel, echoing what the International Court of Justice has said, etc., etc., and leading up to an arms embargo. So I think that Germany has really proven that we are serious about reinforcing humanitarian access in Gaza, and we continue to work on that on a daily basis. So what I want to highlight is that the different objectives we have are not competing, but in an ideal world, they are mutually reinforcing. And this is, I think, what unifies us. What we do is with the very best intentions and with the same objective. We have skipped in the OCHA definition on humanitarian diplomacy the necessity for high-level engagement, because we feel that what can make a difference in alleviating the suffering from the people is not necessarily something that needs to be at the highest level, but also small steps can make a difference. And I think this is also something we can agree with the ultimate goal of making a difference to people in need.
Many thanks, Christina. Also, many thanks for responding very briefly, because time is running up while many difficult questions have been posed to you. In a final question to Max and Amsel, I would like to turn tables a bit. We keep discussing, as we did today, always expectations vis-a-vis donor governments, etc. But of course, humanitarian diplomacy is also a question of agencies, of joint and coordinated, or maybe very individual and not well coordinated red lines, approaches, etc. Is this an issue, you would say, also for northern agencies, for lack of coordination, maybe with local ones, etc.? Is there some more homework also to be done on this front for NGOs and maybe your institutions? Asking for a quick reply and maybe a quick final word if you wish, and then we have to close. Max, maybe you want to start.
Good question. I'd have two short answers. One, yeah, we need to be honest. I think Diakonie Katastrophenhilfe really prides itself on the localization approach. But if I'm doing advocacy on Gaza, getting the feedback from our partners in Gaza who don't have internet, who've been displaced repeatedly, who are suffering from hunger, getting that feedback into my inbox and then sharing that inbox with Christina or your colleague working on Gaza, that's incredibly difficult. And I think Gaza is a specific, like a very, very tough case. But we do need to get better at kind of like using our role as an intermediary to kind of shift the concerns from the local level to the GFFO and not kind of intervene and bring our own perspective into that. I think that's number one. Number two, Christina, correct me, sometimes I feel that NGOs sharing input with you are also window shopping. And in times of shrinking budgets, I think German NGOs are using any opportunity they can get to kind of showcase their programs vis-a-vis the GFFO. And so I think we kind of need to maybe firewall the humanitarian diplomacy from the humanitarian funding question and make sure that we're really trying to advance the protection and access here. And that it's not about trying to get a centimeter ahead for the next funding round.
Many thanks, Max. Another big goal, firewalling funding questions. Amsel, your feedback.
I mean, Max said it perfectly. I do completely agree. The short answer is yes. Obviously, we wouldn't be anywhere without our local partners. We've seen it in Sudan specifically. It is local responders that are helping us reach places where we haven't been able to reach as INGOs or even the UN. So absolutely, we need to make a more concerted effort to ensure that our role as intermediaries helps elevate those voices and it reaches those people that are engaging in high-level humanitarian diplomacy. I know we're exactly at time, so I will keep it at that.
Many thanks, Amsel. And we know that you have to start your regular day of work in New York now. So many thanks to all three of you. I think it was really comprehensive, really to the point. I'm really impressed how you covered this topic, which is so difficult to nail down, as I said in the beginning. I'm sure everybody in the audience wishes all three of you all the best for your important work also in this respect. And many thanks for joining. Have a good day. And stay with us, stay tuned also with Cha for next discussions on this and other matters. Have a good day. Bye-bye.